Len!
Is the connection better?
It is much better.
Okay, good.
You're smiling and looking good for a graduate of the Ohio State University. Len, we've introduced the project and introduced you, so please feel free to weigh in on News 21 and any thoughts that you may have on that.
Okay, good. Do I look really handsome, Gerald?
You look exceptional.
Okay, I want to work on that. Okay, so the Voting Rights Project began with a seminar conducted out of the Cronkite School with technology, something like this, with a number of students at Cronkite itself, and then students from 10 other universities around the country, literally from Harvard all the way down to Florida, all the way west to Oregon, Texas, Colorado, and Missouri, and so on, Oklahoma, so on. During the seminar, I'd done some work beforehand to line up a number of speakers on this subject. We had Republicans who spoke to us about their concerns about voter fraud and why voter ID laws are needed. And we had civil rights representatives of civil rights organizations saying that voter ID was intended to suppress the votes of minorities and older people and college students like you. So we heard both sides of that argument. We also had academic experts who've been looking into these issues over the years, the questions of voting rights, people who were having a difficult time exercising their voting rights, also looking into the whole election fraud question and so on. We had in Arizona, we had the federal administrator, since Arizona is covered by the Voting Rights Act, we had the federal administrator for elections in Maricopa County talk to us about how all that worked, all the technicalities of that. And we had the Secretary of State of Georgia, which is the second state in the union to adopt voter ID some years ago. And according to the Secretary of State, has tried whenever anybody would raise any issues about people having difficulty voting under their voter ID law, they would try to answer them, providing free voter ID, providing easy access to free voter ID, et cetera, to give his side of the story about how they said it was working. He thought working well in Georgia. Then we divided the students up into teams, reporting teams. In some cases, because we had two students at Oklahoma and one in Texas, they were the reporting team, for instance, for Texas. We had a reporting team for Arizona and the Southwest, et cetera, around the country to look into to begin the research and reporting on specific issues growing out of what we heard from our experts. So we were looking at, for instance, the impact of voting rights issues on African-American voters in the South, on Hispanic voters in the Southwest, on college students, that we focused that inquiry in the Midwest. We looked into early voting, which in Oregon and Washington, all voting is done early by mail. There are no polling places. Nobody votes on election day in those two states. How does that work? We had reporters in Florida and in New England looking at the question of voting rights for felons, because every state in the union has a different way of dealing with the voting rights of felons. In Maine and Vermont, you never lose your right to vote. You can vote in prison. There will be voting places in the prisons of Maine and Vermont on Election Day, whereas in Florida, when the new Republican governor took over, he made it more difficult than ever for felons to regain voting rights in Florida after they've served their sentences. Only a few hundred have been able to get their rights restored out of something like, I think it's more than 1 million felons in Florida who would otherwise have the right to vote. So that obviously is a big issue there. And across the country in different states. And then we had them report back around the middle of the seminar on how they were doing. They had to make presentations to the seminar. They used PowerPoint. Some of them shot videos. Some of them did photographs and stuff to tell us where they stood on their research into each of these areas, and to come up with story ideas, specific story ideas that we would want to explore for the outcome of the project. And then discussions ensued from then on sharpening the story ideas, getting more sources involved in our reporting. And then they all came together at the Cronkite School during the summer. And that's when Gerald showed up. We asked Gerald to come and help us edit. We had a story list of 20 stories. Sharon Rosenhaus, the other editor on the project, and Gerald worked with the students to shape those stories. We wound up realizing that we had too many stories that were centered on individual states in the South, combined them all into one South story. Gerald did a marvelous job of convincing the various reporters that I'm sorry, you're not going to have a separate story anymore. You're going to be part of a team in order to get those stories done. And by the end of the summer, we produced it. We actually was more than 20 stories before it got whittled down to 20. And by the end of the summer, we had 20 stories and a number of videos and photo galleries. And in addition to all of that, many of the reporters were shooting video, shooting pictures, doing reporting, and working on the writing of stories, sometimes in teams, sometimes alone. And in addition to that, every one of the reporters also participated in a database research project we did, because hearing all these arguments, is there election fraud or not election fraud? Do we need voter ID or don't we need voter ID? But there was no database showing how much election fraud there was. So one of the students, Corbin Carson, who's had management experience, he actually is a founder and still co-owner of a limousine service in Phoenix, Arizona. So he has management experience and is now a master's student in journalism. Organized the students with the help of Stephen Doig, our Pulitzer Prize winning database journalist at Cronkite School, is a professor there now. And they organized the students to query every one of the 50 states, file freedom of information requests if that was necessary, call up individual counties if that was necessary, to find every single case of election fraud that we could find in all 50 states from the year 2000 to now. And they came up with 2,100 cases, all the individual cases. You can go on the website and you can go through each case one at a time. Sometimes you see who the defendants are, the disposition of the case, and so on. And then with Steve's help, they analyzed all those cases to see just exactly how much election fraud there was and what kind. And they concluded that not only is 2,100 not many cases election fraud, period, compared to the number of voters in the United States, but also that out of that only 10 cases, and I believe maybe only 7 in which there were actual findings of guilt, involved impersonation at the polls. You're going to vote to pretend you're somebody else, which is the only thing that voter ID laws would prevent in terms of election fraud, as opposed to maybe being ways to make it more difficult for certain kinds of people to vote. So that became one of the most important parts of the project. There's no other database like it in the United States. And so a lot of news organizations use that database findings in their stories, even when they didn't take stories from the project. We created the website that I think you're looking at right now with all the material on it. And we also communicated with a number of publishing partners so that they could, when the database went live, they could pick and choose stories to publish in newspapers and on websites around the country. Several dozen newspapers, including the Washington Post, the Arizona Republic, Philadelphia Inquirer, published stories from it. Most of them published the election fraud story based on the database, for example. A number of nonprofit websites around the country published a number of stories from the project. NBCnews.com, one of our best partners, posted all 20 stories on NBCnews.com over a period of a month, and totaled up 7 million page views of people looking at those stories, which is a phenomenal number. So I would estimate that it's hard for us to obviously count page views on the Washington Post, the Arizona Republic, but certainly we had hundreds of thousands of more page views from them, in addition to the circulations for the newspaper. And a number of talk shows on NPR and around the country when discussing the voting rights issue, and in fact, I think we're alerted to the voting rights issue in part because of our project, cited our findings in the discussions that they had with people. And then finally, NPR, just a couple weeks ago, it takes NPR a long time to produce a radio report, had a radio report using 2 of our students, along with one of their producers, on the question of felon voting rights in Florida. Very powerful report. You can find that on npr.org. So that's what we did with the project. I'd selected voting rights as the topic. late last year when I saw that it was election year coming up, and I saw the very first bits of coverage of voting rights being an issue in this election campaign. And as many news organizations began covering voting rights, they could only just use maybe one reporter on the story, maybe only part of the time of one reporter. We were able to provide 24 reporters who went to 40 cities in 21 states in Puerto Rico to do their reporting, which no other news organization could do, which is why a number of them used our stories. And also, I believe that our stories and the impact that they had has served as a catalyst for a great deal more reporting on the subject than there would have been otherwise if we hadn't done this project. Anything else you want me to say about the project, Gerald, before I move to university-produced journalism generally?
No, let me just ask, anybody have a question for Len on this segment? I see no hands. Go right ahead, Len. Thank you.
Okay. So one of the things I'm doing in my new life as an academic, this is starting my fourth year at Arizona State after running the Washington Post for a quarter century, is the role of nonprofit journalism in the future of American journalism. As you all know, I'm sure you've been learning about this, commercial journalism has been shrinking because of the shrinking ad revenue. Some of the audiences are actually larger than ever. It's not that people don't want to read Washington Post journalism, for example. We have more people reading Washington Post journalism every day than we ever had before, but we have less revenue coming in from it. And as a result, like all other news organizations, we've had to gradually reduce our news staff. Ours is still much bigger than most, and many other news staffs have gotten a lot smaller, and try as hard as they can, and many of them are trying very hard with limited resources to do this kind of what I call accountability journalism, investigative reporting, accountability journalism. It's difficult. So some of it's got to come from other places. And a lot of it is beginning to come from nonprofit news organizations founded within the last 2 or 3 years all around the country. ProPublica is a national example of it. California Watch, Texas Tribune are state examples of nonprofits, new nonprofits. There are numbers in cities around the country. There's a new one just starting right now in Santa Barbara, California, for example. Places, in particular places where, like San Diego, where the commercial news organizations are shadows of what they used to be. And so the nonprofit journalism is very important. Journalists who've left commercial news organizations, setting up nonprofits, working with foundations, trying to attract money from donors, and a few universities have begun to start this kind of journalism. Not that many yet compared to the number of journalism schools around the country, but a lot of notable examples, and the Cronkite School is one of the leaders. At the Cronkite School, besides the fact that we're the headquarters for News 21, which is one of these university-based nonprofit journalism organizations now, we have the Cronkite News Service, which has the largest state bureau in the state of Arizona and the only Washington bureau for the state of Arizona. There's no other Washington bureau for an Arizona news organization. So as a result, the Cronkite News Service, every single media organization in Arizona is a client of the Cronkite News Service. We give away the stories free. They are published and broadcast throughout newspapers and stations throughout Arizona. In addition to that, the Cronkite News Watch is a television news program, a half-hour long local news program, all public affairs journalism, no murders or traffic accidents there unless they become a public affairs situation, which is on 4 nights a week on the biggest public television station in Arizona, which happens to be located in the upper floors of the Cronkite Journalism School in downtown Phoenix. Increasingly, one by one, a number of other journalism schools around the country are starting to produce this kind of professional level, if you will, journalism about their communities. This is in addition to student newspapers and student media. We're talking about public media. So, for instance, in New York, the Columbia Journalism School has started an online newspaper called the New York World, which was the name of the original newspaper started by Joseph Pulitzer, for whom the Columbia Journalism School was named in New York, the Graduate School of Journalism there. There are other journalism schools around the country that have started up neighborhood news organizations for neighborhoods that are no longer being covered by the commercial media there. That's going on in Austin, Texas, for instance, where the University of Texas School of Journalism has started up a very good neighborhood news site for an area that's not really being covered by the newspapers down there. And what's happening with all these nonprofits, both the university-based ones and the ones that aren't based in universities, is that they're collaborating with commercial media all over the country. The advantage for the nonprofits, of course, is to have the journalism seen by people beyond their website. Cronkite News has a destination website. You can find it if you want, and you can see all the Cronkite News stories there. But what's more important is that their stories are distributed by the rest of the media throughout Arizona, reaching a much larger audience than the website would ever reach. California Watch, its stories are used by dozens, scores of news media throughout California, reaching a much wider audience than the California Watch website itself would reach by itself. So it's a great advantage for the nonprofits to be seen, to have their work seen. So for instance, News 21, our website, I don't know, not that many people come to our website itself, but I know that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans have read at least one of our stories as a result of our collaboration with our partner news media around the country. For the commercial news media, the advantage to them is that they have first-rate journalism that they can trust from these news organizations that they would not otherwise have. So, for instance, when California Watch did a very good project on the threat of earthquakes to schools throughout California, a story that none of the California media had done, they all were able to pick it up, and it reached everybody throughout California in a way that they would not have had that journalism if it weren't for California Watch. And so California Watch is actually a pioneer among these nonprofits in now charging the commercial news media some fees for their stories. It's still a small amount of money and a small amount of the total revenue for California Watch compared to their foundation grants and their big donations, but it's a beginning towards trying to have some sort of earned revenue as part of their economic model. And so I talk about this new ecosystem of American journalism of commercial news organizations getting smaller, nonprofit news organizations growing up. They're not all going to survive. Some of the commercial news organizations are going to die or be so small that they're not recognizable as very good news organizations any longer. Some of the nonprofits are going to die because they're not going to make it. They're not going to get enough public support. And then in addition to this are, of course, public radio and television. Very few public television stations do any news at all outside of the national news programs that they put on from PBS, which I think is a shame. I think that they have an obligation to do local news. And indeed, the public television station in San Diego stands out as the exception that proves the rule by doing very good local news. And I think more PBS stations should do that. But they're doing it in concert with a local investigative nonprofit, which is located actually in the public television building. So they're partners. These two nonprofits are partners. More radio stations around the country, public radio stations, do news, including accountability journalism, and sometimes in association with NPR. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funnels some federal money to these public stations around the country, has been encouraging them by making special grants for new kinds of investigative reporting and local reporting, sometimes by groups of stations, groups of public television stations, nonprofit journalism organizations, and public television stations in order to encourage that kind of journalism. I think that's the end of my overview, Gerald.
Len, could you talk a little bit about how you arrive at a point where you trust student reporters to do this level of work, and tell our kids how they can prepare themselves for...
Right. Well, at Cronkite, I can just tell you what goes on at Cronkite and then what I do at News 21. At Cronkite, you don't reach the Cronkite News Service until you've been through a lot of reporting classes and probably have student media experience and may well have professional summer internships. I forgot to add that Cronkite has an arrangement with the Arizona Republic, the big newspaper in Phoenix, in which during the course of a semester, about 80 Cronkite students in smaller groups are over there for a semester at a time in paid internships. And therefore, they've been covering local news for the Phoenix newspaper under the tutelage of an editor there who's also a Cronkite teacher at the same time. And as a result, we know which ones are ready to go to work for the Cronkite News Service, and that is a class. It's a class for for graduate students and for upperclassmen who qualify for it. And as a result, we know that they can do that kind of work, and they're working under professional journalists. Steve Elliott, who runs the Cronkite News Service in Phoenix, and Steve Crane, who runs the Cronkite News Service Washington Bureau, are both former professional journalists. Steve Elliott was the AP bureau chief in Arizona, and so they're able to know if their students are doing professional level work. They're constantly in touch with their partner news media, and therefore, if there's a problem, they're able to address it, but seldom are there problems. In fact, the news media are frequently praising the Cronkite News Service for providing a very high professional level work for them that they usually don't have to edit at all before they put it in their newspapers or put it on the air. But part of the secret is the relationships that the Cronkite News Services have with these customers, with these clients, so they get to know the editors and they get to know the students. For News 21, we have more Cronkite students in my seminar than are going to make it for the summer. So I'm able to pick about 1 out of every 2 students in the seminar to stay on to work on the project in the summer. And I told the students, you get an A+ in my class, but still don't appear to me that you're ready for this project, and you won't be selected for the project even though you were a good student. So it's very selective that way. From the other schools, those students are nominated in competitions at their various schools around the country. It's up to each school to decide how they're going to select the people they nominate. But they nominate what they feel are their best people, and they must put money behind it. They must raise the money to provide the stipend. Each of the News 21 fellows has a $7,500 stipend for the summer, just like an internship, and the school has to put up travel money for the reporting. So they're having to invest their own money in it. They're not going to nominate somebody they don't think is going to work out. But they still have to complete the seminar successfully. I'm not grading them. I'm grading the Cronkite students. I'm not grading the national students. But they have to complete the work satisfactory to me. And if I think they're going to do well in the summer, they'll stay for the summer. If I don't, I'll tell them no, even though the university has already put up money for them.
Okay, I know you have to go, and we were a little late.
No, I'm in no hurry. It's up to you.
Anybody have any questions for Professor Downie? Yes, sir. Tell him who you are. You have the advantage. He knows. You know who he is.
My name is Len Downie Lecture. I'm a journalism student here at the University of Arkansas. I'm curious to hear more about these nonprofit journalism organizations. Do they get their revenue from advertisement?
Right.
Could you maybe can you go over to the microphone?
Just yell. He can pick you up now.
Okay. You asked me about the revenue for nonprofit news organizations, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Each of their economic models is different, although they often have the same ingredients, but in different proportions. California Watch depended initially on some big foundation donors. National foundations like the Knight Foundation, but also big California foundations that were concerned about the fact that the resources to cover big issues in California, you probably all know that California is having huge problems, budget problems and other big problems in the state, at a time when the commercial news organizations in California had greatly cut down on their state coverage. Some of them no longer had any state reporters at all, and even big places like the Los Angeles Times had fewer state reporters than they used to have. So these foundations were very concerned about the future of the state. They've given California Watch millions of dollars in grants to provide this coverage. In addition, they raise money through donations, through fundraisers. They're very much like public radio and television. They have memberships that they sell memberships to people, and not sell them, but they ask for people to make contributions as members of those news organizations. And in the cases I said of California Watch, they're a pioneer in charging news organizations for content. I don't know if there's any advertising on that site, but some of the local sites, like the Voice of San Diego, do sell advertising to local businesses or have what they call business sponsors, just like, again, public radio and television have, where you hear, if you listen to NPR, you'll hear these sponsors. It's not exactly supposed to be a commercial, but it sounds like it. People who've contributed to NPR and then get mentioned on the air. In Texas, the Texas Tribune was founded by a local businessman there and a very prominent Texas journalist who know a lot of rich Texans. And as a result, they have a lot of strong donations from big rich Texans, in addition to some of their foundation support. And they and others like MinnPost in Minneapolis hold big fundraising events. where they find ways. Say, in the case of Texas Tribune, they're holding lectures all the time. They're able to bring in big name people and sell seats to these lectures as one of their ways of raising funds. They're considered donations to the Texas Tribune. So it depends on, and in other cases, some of the smaller investigative reporting projects like the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Reporting or the Florida Center for Investigative Reporting are actually located in universities. So that means that you have the university, if you convince the university to be your partner, you've got the advantage of the university's overhead. The university provides you with the offices that you need, and in many cases hires professional journalists onto their faculty, who of course have to also teach, but at the same time are also the reporters, advisors, or editors for these nonprofit investigative reporting projects.
Yes. Belt it out. It's good.
I was wondering since...
Who are you?
Oh, thank you very much. I'm Catherine Sherrills. I teach here at the University of Arkansas Journalism Department.
Hi, Catherine.
Because when we talk about this nonprofit model, we keep comparing it to NPR. I'm wondering, would there be an extension of that model? NPR has national public radio, but then it has its affiliates in each town. Would there be a need and even a possibility that there might be some kind of national organization that would help to raise money and help to guide these city nonprofit newspaper or online services?
Good question. First of all, important thing to point out about NPR is, of course, that all the local stations are independent, and they pay NPR for NPR content. So NPR is actually NPR is actually a cooperative, in essence, owned by the local stations. And so that's how the connection with NPR works. So it's mutually beneficial for them to help each other. And as I said, they're working hard on increasing investigative reporting by both NPR itself and by the various stations. There is a national organization that has been formed by these nonprofits. I was there at the formation meeting about 3 or 4 years ago. It's called the Investigative News Network. And it is each of the nonprofits who qualify join it, pay a membership fee. And what INN does is several things. First of all, it holds seminars and other things to help them learn how to raise money, learn how to form the business side of their operation, because a lot of these nonprofits have been started by journalists who have no idea how to handle business. If I was starting one of these, I wouldn't know what to do on the business side, and they can't afford to hire a business person, so somebody has to teach them, elementary things. And also it's trying to provide things like legal services, free legal services for these organizations, in case they have stories that have to be lawyered before they're published or broadcast. And it also is becoming a syndicate for them. So, for instance, News 21 stories were syndicated, that is to say, distributed to these nonprofit members of INN by INN itself. We sent the stories to INN. They sent it out to various nonprofit news sites, many of which published our stories around the country. And they're also sharing content among themselves, so that 3 or 4 or 5 INN members on a couple of occasions have worked together on an investigative project and shared the stories. Or one of them may do a story that interests some of the others, and they will take those stories, maybe put a local lead on top of it, and use those stories. So it's not yet as big and powerful as your question implied, but it's trying to head in that direction.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Shelby Gill. I'm a junior news editorial student, and I'm a reporter for the Len Newsroom. This is a question that's relating back to the News 21 project. I was wondering, when the students go out to different states, did they go in teams, or were there ever like one fellow by themselves out gathering data?
Yeah, both. It just depended. So, for instance, we had one fellow in Oregon, and he did all the reporting on mail voting there. And we had another fellow at Syracuse who did the reporting on required mail voting in the 2 states that only allow mail voting. And then we had a reporter at Syracuse who did reporting on absentee ballot voting elsewhere. where where it's not required, but you can do absentee ballot voting. And what we found was, particularly in the West, was a great increase in voluntary absentee ballot reporting. In Arizona, 2/3 to 3/4 of the vote are cast by absentee ballots, even though there will be polling places open on Election Day, because Arizonans like doing that for whatever reason. And the state laws in many of these states were changed, where you used to have an excuse for absentee voting, where you had to say, you know, I'm going to be sick on Election Day or out of the state. Now, many states have no excuses absentee voting. Arizona is one of them. And as a result, that's been growing. This election year, at least 35% of all the votes cast in this election will be cast by mail rather than in person. So when we discovered that the two of them were finding this out, we put them together then to do one early voting story. But in some other cases, a reporter in Florida who was working on, he was investigating this movement among Republican state legislators across the country to pass these voter ID laws over the last 2 or 3 years. He worked alone the whole time and produced the story all by himself because that's what he was doing. In other cases, we had as many as 4 or 5 reporters working together, for instance, on the impact of these voting rights issues on African American voters in the South, because we had reporters in so many southern states.
It'll pick up. Go ahead.
Hi, Len. My name is Brett Schulte. I'm an instructor at the journalism department. I was wondering.
Hi, Brett.
I was wondering if you've noticed a difference in the way the media had covered the idea of election fraud or voter fraud before the News 21 project, and how the media has been covering the subject since your News 21 project.
Right. Well, much more aggressively, and obviously making use of our election fraud database, because no such thing existed before. So references just way beyond the people that have published our stories, references to the database, you know, in the context of stories, just pop up everywhere. We can't even count them anymore. They're just everywhere, as well as being mentioned constantly. I mean, one entire Diane Rehm show was spent by people arguing over the meaning of the election fraud database. I think it had an impact. At the same time, I have to say that as coverage of this increase, and particularly as our project had impact, both sides of the argument, each of the two sides of the argument, realized that this was getting increased coverage, so they began pushing their views more, and that also helped increase coverage. So I think the project was definitely a catalyst towards the increase of the coverage, but it wasn't the only factor.
Did it come up in the court cases at all in Pennsylvania and other states, any of this coverage?
Yeah, I was surprised that they didn't cite our database, perhaps because the court cases, you know, were moving rapidly and because they were state specific. But for instance, in the court case in Pennsylvania, they were arguing over numbers being provided by the Pennsylvania Secretary of State, when in fact they could have looked up Pennsylvania in our database and there it was. For some reason, it didn't come up so much in the court cases, maybe because of the legal way in which those cases are argued.
Thank you.
Professor Downie, it's Catherine Troscan. When you said you didn't know why they didn't talk about them in the court cases, do you run into people saying, oh, those are just students?
Yes. And those are people that want to argue against it, usually. They want to say that somehow we're wrong and that, yes, it's just students. And not only that, there are some that say, oh, yeah, Len Downie was involved with that project. He comes from the liberal Washington Post. Now we know what he's up to, kind of thing, too. But the information stands on its own, and most people who've made reference to it have respect for it and treat it as what it is. I mean, it's a database. You don't have to take our word for it. You can go to our site and go through the database. You go through every single case. So it's hard to argue that whether or not it was produced by students or whether or not it has anything to do with the Washington Post or me, it's right there in black and white. You can't argue with that.
And I thought it was particularly helpful to post every document that we got. So
yes.
In the case of one Secretary of State or state official who literally took our letter, had a cup of coffee on it because we see the ring, and just wrote by hand, no cases, and sent it back to us. And that's posted.
Right.
That's posted.
Yeah.
So nobody can say, well, you hid the responses. Everything that we got in return is copied and it's posted. And
It's available on Document Cloud. If you don't know what Document Cloud is, it is a repository open to all journalists and the public of documents that journalists mostly post in order to analyze them, in order to invite other people to analyze them, and as we did, in order to show proof of your research. And so all those documents are available on Document Cloud, and the site tells people how to get there.
Any other questions?
I'm Dale Carpenter, a teacher in the journalism department.
Yeah.
The data that you present, was that all cases that were prosecuted, that were actually, where people got caught doing it? Is that what the numbers come from?
Yes, the cases are all the cases that were official cases, which means some of them weren't prosecuted because when they were investigated, it was found to be a mistake, or there was an explanation for it. It wasn't a crime, but it's all the official cases in each of the 50 states. Yes.
So, was there ever any discussion about possible fraud that where it was not detected? It was, they got away with it.
Yes, if you read the stories, you'll see that we asked experts about exactly that. And most of them said, yeah, there could be some, but particularly in the voter impersonation area, they would be surprised because it would be discovered. Voter impersonation gets discovered, which is why we're surprised that people think it's widespread, because it's impossible to hide it. But also, we did ask experts about it, and experts said, by and large, two things. If there is undiscovered voter fraud, it's probably in the absentee ballot area, which is not covered by voter ID, obviously, because there are people that go around on each side, on both sides, bundling up absentee ballots, that is to say, going like to a nursing home and passing out absentee ballots and making sure everybody in the nursing home votes for, Joe Blow, and then collecting them and mailing them in. And that would be hard. That might be hard to detect. Some people get caught doing that, and many of the cases are absentee ballot fraud cases, but that could be the case. The other thing they pointed out is that by far, the most numbers of election problems don't come from fraud, but from mistakes. The United States does not have national elections. We have so-called national elections, but they're conducted one county at a time, one state at a time. And as a result, there are different rules in every county and every state. There are the election workers are well-meaning volunteers, usually unpaid volunteers, who are only doing this once every 2 or 4 years. And as a result, there are lots, and the laws are changing all the time, there are lots and lots of mistakes. And that accounts for several times when things were cited by people who said, oh, you're not counting all the election fraud. Here's this. They were mistakes. Counting mistakes. There have been, complete reversals in some precincts of results because somebody made a snafu in operating the machinery or recording something by pencil. So the biggest problem that needs to be attended to is improving the machinery for our holding elections. And I think you're going to see on this election night a lot more of that, in addition to perhaps fights between the right and the left over who's casting which ballots.
Well, Len, thank you so much. You've been really gracious with your time. And
thank you. My pleasure, Gerald, and thanks for the good questions.
Can you put the News 21, who can vote, back up, please? Len mentioned the mistakes. That was a huge finding that we had. Lots of mistakes. Most of them people just accidentally voting. Or people who move. And they might have voted in one place in the primary, voted another place in the general, and somehow or another that was read as an attempt to defraud the electorate. Photo ID laws. Here's some other things we found. Photo ID laws and other new voting restrictions disproportionately affect students, the disabled, the elderly, and minorities. State rules on voting by felons vary widely. He told you a little bit about the Florida project. In Florida, 1 in 10 felons, 1 in 10, never get their rights restored. And you say, well, big whoop, they committed a crime. A lot of them were your age, they got busted for marijuana. Or they were in a car where somebody had a few grams of cocaine. I have no idea what quantities it comes in. I have no cocaine experience. I can talk to you about bourbon, but I don't know anything about coke. Bourbon is legal. More than half the state bills, and there were 37 legislatures that either passed or are considering photo ID voter laws. Most than half of the state bills proposing these photo IDs originated from people affiliated with a conservative, pro-business American Legislative Executive Council, ALEC. ALEC produced the model legislation for this photo ID. The 2009 Voter ID Act, 62 bills were drafted from that, copied from that. And he told you about the one reporter who discovered this. There are a couple of connections here. One is that it was drafted by, what's Paul's son's name, boy? Baby Greenberg, what's his name? Anyway, Paul Greenberg's son. Paul Greenberg's son. Paul Greenberg's editorial writer for the editorial page editor for the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. And the copies were such that in some state legislatures, they didn't even bother to change the state. They had this legislation that originated with Arkansas, even though they might have been in Texas or Georgia or South Carolina. So that's how thin it was. Changes in the Florida voting laws, they say, will reduce in-person early voting, meaning they've shrunken the time period when you can vote early. And the critical change here was the Sunday before Election Day, which was very popular in African American congregation. They call it Souls to the Polls. And they had that last Sunday, but day after tomorrow after that, whenever Sunday comes up. It's not legal anymore in Florida. There's another organization called True the Vote, and this is a Texas-based Tea Party initiative that has trained and dispatched election observers to at least 20 states. And the idea, they say, is to prevent voter fraud. But opponents say it's just a way to intimidate eligible voters, particularly in districts where there are lots of seniors and minorities. And another thing we found out in this series was that the once sort of neutral, and Professor Purvis will back me up on this, kind of a repository for burnout politicians, this Office of Secretary of State has become a coveted office for political operatives, people who actually want to have some influence. It's become a little powerful office, a little fiefdom. So we have that story on this website, and I strongly encourage you to go to the site, read it. There's some really good reporting, and you should appreciate this because this was all done by kids, by students. Absolutely amazing. So what was the result of it? Listen to Kristen Gilger. She couldn't be with us today. She's Associate Dean in charge of professional programs for the Cronkite School, and she was Chief Administrator for News 21. And she has a rich appreciation for what student journalists can produce because she was Director of Student Media at Arizona State. And before that, she was Deputy Managing Editor for News at the Arizona Republic, Managing Editor at the Statesman Journal in Salem, Oregon, and she served in various editing positions in New Orleans. And she has a master's degree in journalism, bachelor's and master's degree in journalism from Professor Schulte's alma mater, the University of Nebraska, somewhere in there, I believe it is. Did I get Nebraska right?
That's one of the square ones in the middle.
This is what Kristen Gilger says about the project. And she had to report to, I told you about the sponsors, the people who backed the project. She had to report to them recently. We believe the Voting Rights Project represents the largest and most successful distribution of student-generated public service journalism ever. It's certainly, the most successful of any News 21 project to this point in terms of web traffic and print and web publication. And you can go to News 21 and see where last year the project was food safety, transportation before that, and I forget the one before that, but they've done some notable national projects. This one was the grandest of them all by the dean's own estimate. Through the end of October, 25 different news organizations, and Len named a few of them, used the work of News 21 Who Can Vote. Major national news organizations published the findings, including the Post, the Center for Public Integrity, NBCNews.com. And these news organizations, along with the main News 21 Voting Rights Project, votingrights.news21.com, generated nearly 8 million page views and almost 18,000 comments in the first 6 weeks after publication. Traffic to the site was far higher than any previous News 21 project, and it far surpassed the second most viewed project last year. Food safety was last year. Last year was transportation, which drew 1.2 million. No, I think she's got that wrong. Last year was food safety. In addition to traffic to the project on the partner and News 21 websites, the project drew considerable attention on social media. And this, again, is the students who initiated this. Generating nearly 40,000 Facebook likes, almost 5,000 tweets, and almost 6,000 other shares, and earning a Reddit, what is R-E-D-D-I-T? Thank you. Reddit, help me out here, what am I trying to mean? Reddit score of 209 points. Is that good?
Yes,
How high can you get when you read it? Okay, well, we're going to try harder. Other news organizations that distributed the content included National Public Radio, you've heard that, and you can go to their website and see it. More than 36 news organizations ranging from the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Detroit Free Press, the Wall Street Journal, referred to the findings. So this was a stunning bit of investigative journalism done by students. Hope that you enjoyed the presentation and that you will take from this the possibilities of what you can do in your own careers and what we can do here at some point, one of these days, God willing. Yes?
What if one of the students wanted to apply for News 21? Would that be possible?
It would be possible. The first thing that we would have to do is run and try to raise $10,000. That's the buy-in. And the application is due, I think, by the end of this month. So it's the 10,000 has been the big sticking point.
If they were young enough, they could shoot for next year.
If you're a sophomore or a junior and if you want to think about that now, please do. Talk to me about it. And there's maybe by then we can raise the money. I know that we do have some modest IRE funds, and maybe we can talk to Professor Carpenter about the prospect of cobbling together a dowry for you. Any other questions? Folks, I thank you kindly. I hope that you enjoyed this. I will see you around the quad. Thank you for asking a question.